Thank you for letting me address this audience. I was introduced to charter cities by Paul Romer some years ago, and he completely convinced me that we needed a new legal system, which I think was convincingly also developed by the previous speaker. I am completely sold on it. However, I'm an urban planner, and I have seen a lot of cities being created from scratch and failed, and some succeed. And so there are some physical elements which has to be respected if you want a city to succeed. My fear, and I share it with Paul, my fear with Charter City is that we could find a system, a legal system, which would be perfect, when I think the previous talk showed pretty much the way. And imagine that for just some logistic mishap, this perfect city suddenly fail because of a cash flow problem or transport problem for labor. So I would like to address this aspect. Again, using my experience, I never developed a charter city, I have to confess, although I worked a lot on in Hong Kong, in Shenzhen in particular, and also in China in special economic development zone. So I would like to share my experience about what happened when you have an embryonic city which is growing. And an embryonic city, like any living organism, is very fragile. It can die very easily in infancy. There is a lot of infant mortalities about satellite town and new cities. So I would like here to remind people that once this city is created, it has to be viable, and a lot of things have to come together. One of the approach to do that is that as you develop the legal system, you should not do in sequence first the legal system, then the location, then when you have the location to say what will be the standard which will be used or how the market will work. And then when everything is finished, the design is finished, look at the financial system. I think we should develop all these aspects in parallel. Even if at the beginning it's on the back of an envelope, working sequentially and doing the financial part at the very end is a terrible mistake. So let us go. There are two aspects really which I think are crucial in the physical development of a city. First is a location. And this, I had some disagreement with Paul at the time. Paul told me he thinks that very easily we could put 60 charter cities around the world very quickly. I thought that there is no 60 sites around the world which can be developed into a major city, because cities are linked to location. Now, as we will see, locations are also changing. So we will see that. The next item on location is, of course, where does the population come from? What are the systems which will allow people to come to the city? So you need a migration model. Is it Dubai? Is it Singapore? My best example was, and very few people know that, Shanghai in the 20s was the only city where you could get without a passport. The only city. So it has a lot of refugees leaving the Soviet Union was just be created. We're going to Shanghai. Very few people knew that. I don't think there is one place in the world now where you could go without a passport. So Shanghai in the 20s was an example. Now, after that, there is what I call the embryonic growth. That means, okay, we have a city, we have a site, We know where the labor will come, where the inhabitants of the city are coming. How do we get the city to reach a critical size? How long will be this embryonic period where it will be very vulnerable? And finally, cash flows. I have seen a lot of new cities, new development, economic development zone destroyed by bad cash flows. I will go a little more in detail on that. So let us look at location. We have a lot of examples of cities which were created ex nihilo, or tabula rasa. I have here two lists. One are ports, which are, again, on trade routes. A number of cities were developed, usually for strategic reasons, many of them, as we'll see, by the British Navy, by the way, and Gibraltar, Aden, Port Said, Djibouti. Those cities, by the way, Aden and Djibouti, for instance, were created by the British Navy and the French Navy when you start having steam engine. It was coal depot. They needed a place to put the coal. And those places, of course, were strategic. However, neither Aden or Djibouti came close to a charter city or even a successful city the way Singapore did or Hong Kong did. And again, here, the rule of law was a big difference. Hong Kong and Shenzhen were, I think, interesting example and closer to charter cities in a way than we think. Shenzhen, I remember Shenzhen in 1984, I think, my first visit to Shenzhen. It was still a fishing village. And the planners there had a very ambitious plan to develop for a city of 5 million people. And at the time, if you took the rural population was there in the area, there were about 250,000 people, but half of them rural. And unfortunately, for my record, I told the Chinese, you are far too ambitious. We will finance a city of 1 million, 1.5 million, but 5 million is crazy. I thought that the logistic would be impossible. Shenzhen is now 12 million people and is very affluent. So that's one skeleton in my closet. Now, the other new cities are capitals. These do not count. They are not example. Because, Brasilia, Canberra, Chandigarh, Islamabad, Naypyidaw, Abuja, those were done by government fiat. The embryonic stage was easy because the money was coming from a central government. So, for instance, if we talk about, Brasilia, you had, in fact, the taxpayer of all of Brazil was paying for it. So, money was no object. So that's not the way you build a charter city. The question of location didn't count either, because in Brasilia, the Brazilian government say, well, all our civil servants are going to move there at this date. They had no choice. And when the civil servant move, of course, the lobbyists will move too, a lot of people will move. Location was no object, was not important. So this could be said for about all those cities. They are absolutely no example for us. So the location of cities has been a large factor in their success and failures. I'm showing here the trade route. I'm showing here the trade route, the first globalization done by the Portuguese Navy. And that was the first trade routes which were worldwide, really, if you don't count the Silk Road, in the antiquity. So here are the places where you have good ports, and you are in area which have also water, and that was an example of the first trade route. Location for the Portuguese was very important. Now, of course, location was also dependent on the technology of navigation. They needed to resupply their ship in a relatively short distance. These are the current shipping routes. I think that any city which is completely outside those normally will not be viable. However, we have new shipping routes now, which are just the air routes, which completely change, of course, the location and the advantage of a location. Dubai, by the way, developed not so much because of its port, although the port was important, but because it was on an air route, which was very important location. Normally, this location, halfway between Asia and Europe, would have been taken by Tehran, but Tehran, again, if we talk about the rule of law, was not ideal to have an international hub, and therefore there was no alternative in a certain way that Dubai, who had no hinterland, who had no population, who was nothing there, understood exactly as it was explained in the previous talk, that just by changing the rule of law, they could capture this, the advantage of their location. Now, we have new locations now. We have the Chinese, Belt and Road Initiative. It's a new Silk Road. This is a terminology. And the Chinese, by this way, want to establish new trade routes because they are very concerned that the Strait of Malacca, they are dependent on shipping through the Strait of Malacca. It could be blocked, and they could be isolated. And again, we are talking here about this global trade that the Chinese seems to be taking more seriously than our more traditional market economy for some reason. So this established new routes. Are they going to succeed? There are a lot of criticism about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, in the way it's done, in the political or even military implication of it. My advice, maybe based on my Shenzhen experience, takes the Chinese seriously. They may do it in a very different way. They may have some, even pretty objectionable way of doing things, but they are going to do it. The infrastructure is going to be there. Think again about the example which were of Dubai or Saudi Arabia. Those countries are not well known for the rule of law, and they were able, or they might be able, to develop little enclave where you have the rule of law. The same thing could happen on the new trade route. There is a new one too, which is the Arctic route. This most probably will be a viable route for shipping in the next 20 years or 30 years. That creates also a new possible location. Now, the next thing is, when you have a good location, which on a trade route, where does the population come from? So I will give two examples here, based on what I call the interland population, a population which is already there. For instance, in the case of Honduras, the first where Paul Romer was initially working, the idea is that probably most of the people in the charter city will come from Central America. So that's the interland population. There was no problem of where do the labor will come from. I will take two examples here where I've been working. One is Walvis Bay in Namibia, where there is a relatively well-developed economic zone. And then Swining in China, in Sichuan, where I work on an economic development zone and explain a bit how it works. And then you have to decide, once you have an interland population or no interland population, like was the case in the Gulf, for instance, you have to decide what is your migration model. So is it Dubai and Singapore, where, for instance, you give visa to people, you select a group of people, skilled, non-skilled, and you select who is going to join? Or is it Shanghai in the 1920s, where you have no passport, anybody can join? So you have a mix of people who are just random, the way it was in Shanghai at the time. In Shanghai at the time, the population was refugees from mainland China because of the warlord, there was a civil war, there was a warlord. So there were a lot of people who were desperate, starving, who come to Shanghai. But you had also very wealthy businessmen coming from Russia and, leaving the Soviet Union. And you have all sorts of people. So that's a model. And then you have the model of Shenzhen. What happened really in Shenzhen was, Deng Xiaoping put a line around the periphery and said, within this line, for the first time in China, firms will be free to hire who they want and to pay them according to supply and demand for labor. That was, to us, it seems normal. For China, it was absolutely revolutionary. So by creating this rule, suddenly a lot of people came to Shenzhen, and here the labor are coming all over China, and you know that because although it's in a region where everybody speak Cantonese, in Shenzhen you have a majority of people speaking Mandarin, the main, so it shows really where the migration comes from. It attracted people from all over China. So again, there might be other migration model, I don't know, but this is of course something you have to sort out, because that's that will be the variable which will influence the most my next item, which is the cash flow. So let us look first, very quickly, Walvis Bay. Walvis Bay, you see the location here, it's in Namibia. It was developed originally, of course, by the Portuguese, then the British Navy, and then it was administered by South Africa. And when Namibia became independent, it was an enclave of the South African military. Eventually, with the fall of apartheid, Walvis Bay was returned to Namibia, and they created practically immediately an economic development zone. They call it economic processing zone. They had as an asset a completely independent municipal jurisdiction. So it would have been, by the way, a fantastic place to start a charter city, because the military administration was completely removed, and you could really start from scratch, although you already had in a legal vacuum, really, between Namibia and South Africa. But you had already a cadre of people. You had, no land constraint. You had a deep port. You still had to invest, to expand the port. You had to, of course, develop housing for the workers. And the main problem was really water. You need to have, if you had an expanding population, you had to have a desalination plant. So here again, we are coming into cash flow issues. So this is the way Walvis Bay look, and the export processing zone now is rather successful. They have further developed it. By the way, when I worked there, I was very surprised to see that already it was Mercedes who had a plant there. It was cheaper to send containers from Germany to Namibia and back just to assemble some component, not manufacture, assemble them and ship them back to Germany. This is again where trade routes are. It was cheaper to do that because of the labor cost of Namibia. At the same time, a relatively educated population. So this was the investment. I will go, Of course, you have to develop on housing. Land was no issue. It's, Walvis Bay is in the Namibian desert, so you can expand ad infinitum. The climate is wonderful. The water is a little cold if you like swimming, but here in Northern California, you're used to it. It had, this was a successful example, again, not a charter city. Now you have, mostly Namibian rules. I am not very, knowledgeable about what they are, but but they have no constraint, by the way, on migration, because although the country is not very dense, they had an airport, and a lot of people from South Africa will move there, whether they were cadre, very educated people, or laborer even, so they had no problem there. Let us look now at this embryonic growth, reaching critical size for economic viability. What is very important when you start developing a new city? You have a number of costly, unscalable infrastructure. One of them is airport. When you think at, sometimes people say, well, Silicon Valley developed by itself. It piggybacked on an international airport that they didn't have to develop. So an airport, you cannot develop an airport but just having a gravel runway if you want to develop a city, as a charter city. You need already a pretty viable airport where international, airline can land. You need a deep port usually, unless, if we are thinking about the Silk Road of the Chinese develop in Central Asia, it's possible then you need maybe a railway link or a highway link instead of a deep port, but that will be costly. You need a sewer plant. Very difficult to develop a sewer plant for, say, 1,000 inhabitants and then grow it into 10,000 and 100,000. You probably have to develop a sewer plant already for 200,000 or even 1 million people. It's very costly upfront. Water supply system. You need also major administrative and social facilities. Nobody will move to a new city if there are not hospitals and schools. Then you have the scalable infrastructure, the local road, the social facilities, and the worker housing. This can be developed as the city grows. And so the infrastructure requirement and the rate of growth of the labor force will determine the cash flow. And that means the financial viability of this city. If this city is developed privately through bonds or whatever system, this financial viability is crucial if you don't want the city to die. The question is, when you develop this city physically, how do you balance those unscalable infrastructure, which has to be there at the beginning, and the scalable one? And the timing where you develop those will define this financial viability. A slight difference in timing between the time you invest in infrastructure investment and the time you start having a return on your investment, which is by selling land, this slight difference can make or break a city. I will give you the example extracted from my working file from Swinning, where I work on the economic development zone. So this is a very simple graph, but to create this graph, you have an enormous upfront database which link together the infrastructure cost, the land use, the number of people who are going to live there at a different time, and again, the cost of borrowing. So here, let me describe here. Here you have under this different line, the phasing, every yellow line here is a year, and the smaller one are quarters. This is when, different type of infrastructure are being developed. You see some are developed very quickly, like the blue one. This is the resettlement cost of people who are on the right-of-way of major roads. So you have to do that right away. So this is an enormous cost, and it's relatively long. And then the most important thing then, the purple one, the last one, is the revenues. That means when you start selling land or leasing land, whatever system you have. Now, depending on how these are compressed, this will make or break your project. Here below that, we have here the total expenditure, per quarter, and here you have the total income per quarter. And here, you may not see it very well in gray, you have the cash flow. That means that when you arrive here in year 3, you have the maximum borrowing. In this case, if I remember well, I cannot read the number there, but it was about $600 million. You have the maximum borrowing, and you pay interest on this borrowing. So here, that was the financial image at appraisal. We had a rate of return after 10 years of practically 10%, based on our assumption of expenditure and revenue. If we have a slight alteration, here, for instance, our revenue came a little later. It took more time to have developers and entrepreneurs buy the land. The Chinese were a little, they wanted first to use administrative auction, what they call it, administrative auction, and finally, under the pressure of the World Bank, managed to have real auction, although they were not as real as they should have been. So it kind of slowed down the revenue. So suddenly, this project, which had a 10% rate of return, came down to 1.25%, which is very close to bankruptcy. A slight thing could make bankruptcy. You see here the difference, and it doesn't show that much. It's just that, the amount of borrowing is much longer and larger. What may happen in a private venture? Here again, we have the Chinese government in the back. They will not allow Swinning to go bankrupt. So eventually they will come, a Chinese-owned bank will just foot the bill. Imagine that we have not anticipated very well what will be the price of land sold. And by the way, the land sold here is differentiated between different type of housing, commerce, industrial, and things like that, which is their price for each of them. So this is an aggregation of all that. Here, we just make a supposition that the price of land overall, we were too optimistic, it's 20% less than we thought. Then the system is completely bankrupt. You see, at a certain time here, the people who are backing up financially are getting cold feet, and they may stop refinancing. And that will be the end of this. So, I will summarize here. The viability of newly created city depends on 3 factors. And I'm talking here only of the physical part of the city, not the legal one, which is his raison d'etre, really. But location, and again, there are new locations. I acknowledge that not only the Portuguese trade route, obviously, the migration policy, that has to be, I never seen really a very elaborate thing about that. I think this is extremely important. And the time required to reach a positive financial cash flow. If the cash flow remains negative for more than 10 years, forget about it, as we say in New Jersey. Thank you.